James Walker had flown planes for most of his life. At 53, the lines around his eyes told stories of thousands of takeoffs and landings, countless sunrises witnessed from above the clouds. 25 years as a commercial pilot had come after 7 intense years in the Air Force, where he'd flown everything from cargo planes to fighter jets. On that Tuesday morning, nothing seemed unusual as he strode through Chicago O'Hare Airport. Pulling his captain's suitcase behind him, he nodded at familiar faces among the ground crew. Flight 2473 to Seattle was scheduled for an on-time departure, and James liked keeping schedules. "Morning, Captain," said Diane, the lead flight attendant who'd worked with him dozens of times before. "Full flight today." "Anything I should know about?" James asked, his deep voice carrying the slight drawl of his Texas upbringing. "Nothing special, though security flagged a few passengers for extra screening. All clear now." James nodded, filing the information away. He'd learned long ago that details mattered. In the cockpit, his co-pilot Tom was already running through pre-flight checks. The younger man had been flying with James for 3 years now and respected the captain's methodical approach. "Weather's clear to Denver, but we've got some turbulence predicted over the Rockies," Tom said, pointing to the radar. James studied the patterns, mentally calculating alternate routes if needed. "We'll adjust altitude when we get there. Let's stick to the flight plan for now." As passengers boarded, James did what he always did, stood near the cockpit door watching them enter. Some pilots stayed hidden away, but James believed in seeing who was on his plane. He noticed 4 men who boarded separately but seemed to glance at each other. One carried a laptop bag that seemed unusually heavy. Just an observation, he thought, probably nothing. Once everyone was seated, James made his welcome announcement, his voice reassuring as he mentioned the expected flight time and weather conditions. Passengers settled in, most already tuning him out as they prepared for the 4-hour journey. The takeoff was smooth, the massive Boeing 737 responding perfectly to James's touch as they climbed through scattered clouds into the bright morning sky. Chicago's sprawling cityscape gave way to the patchwork quilt of Midwestern farmland below. 2 hours into the flight, James was discussing retirement plans with Tom, fishing in Montana, maybe teaching at the flight school near his home, when he noticed the cabin call light blinking. "Captain," Diane's voice came through his headset. Her tone was casual, but James detected something forced about it. "We have a passenger asking about our exact route, kind of insistent about it." James felt a slight prickle at the back of his neck. In his experience, ordinary passengers rarely cared about exact flight paths unless they were aviation enthusiasts. "Is it one of the men who boarded separately?" "Dark jacket, heavy laptop bag?" he asked. The pause on the line was brief but telling. "Yes." "How did you know?" "Just a hunch. Tell him it's standard procedure to follow air traffic control guidance, and we don't discuss specific flight paths during the journey." James kept his voice even. "And Diane?" "Ask Pete to check if his friends are moving around the cabin more than normal passengers would." Pete was their air marshal. Not all flights had one, but international routes and certain domestic flights still carried the plainclothes security officers. James had spotted him during boarding, sitting in an aisle seat near the middle of the plane. "Will do," Diane replied, her professional tone not revealing what they both suspected might be happening. James turned to Tom. "Let's be extra alert. Something doesn't feel right." He'd had this feeling once before, over the Persian Gulf years ago. That time, he'd been right. The skies had darkened as Flight 2473 continued westward. What had been a clear blue canvas was now painted with heavy gray clouds that stretched across the horizon. In the passenger cabin, the overhead lights created a soft glow against the growing gloom outside. James kept one eye on the weather radar, watching the storm system that was developing faster than forecast. He'd need to request a higher altitude soon to avoid the worst of the turbulence. But right now, his mind was split between flying the plane and the strange situation unfolding behind him. "Pete confirms your suspicion." Diane's voice came through his headset, quiet but tense. "All 4 men have visited the bathroom in the last 30 minutes. 2 of them tried to make conversation with him about the cockpit door procedures." James felt his heart rate pick up slightly, though his hands remained steady on the controls. 25 years of training kept his voice calm as he asked, "Any visible signs of weapons?" "Nothing obvious. but the tall one with the beard keeps checking something in his jacket pocket. And they've all refused drink service but asked for water bottles. Tom looked over at James, eyebrows raised in question. I'm going to contact air traffic control, James decided. Let's adjust our heading slightly, might give us a better read on what these guys are planning. He radioed their Denver sector controller, requesting a minor course correction due to developing weather, a perfectly reasonable request that wouldn't raise any flags to anyone listening in. The controller approved the change, and James banked the plane gently to the north. Almost immediately, the cabin call light blinked again. Captain, the bearded man is asking why we changed direction. He seems concerned. Diane's voice had dropped to just above a whisper. James nodded to himself. Normal passengers rarely noticed such supple course changes. Tell him we're avoiding some weather, standard procedure. And Diane? Have the other flight attendants move the drink carts to block the aisles near rows 12 and 27. Those were the rows where two of the suspicious men were seated. As Diane acknowledged his instructions, James made another decision. He reached for a pad of paper and quickly wrote a note to Tom. Alert protocol, possible hijacking attempt. I'm going to check the cabin personally. Tom's eyes widened, but he nodded once firmly. He was a good co-pilot, nervous, but he'd follow procedure. You have the controls, James said formally, passing command to Tom. I need to stretch my legs. Standing up, James removed his jacket and loosened his tie slightly. To anyone watching, he'd look like a pilot taking a routine break, but underneath his calm exterior, every sense was heightened. As he stepped out of the cockpit, making sure the reinforced door locked behind him, James scanned the cabin casually. The bearded man was in seat 15C, leaning forward with tension visible in his shoulders. Another man, 2 rows behind, was watching James with too much intensity. James nodded politely to passengers as he made his way down the aisle, stopping to chat briefly with a young boy who was excited to meet the pilot. All the while, he was mapping positions, counting seconds, forming a plan. When he reached the mid-cabin galley, Diane was preparing coffee, her movements deliberate and slow. They're getting ready for something, she murmured without looking up. The one in 29 keeps checking his watch, and they've all moved their carry-ons to under the seats in front of them for easier access. James poured himself a cup of coffee, appearing completely at ease. How many passengers on board who might be able to help if needed? There's a woman in 8B who told me she's a cop. And that big guy in the exit row mentioned he was military when I seated him. James nodded, taking a sip of coffee. Good to know. I'm going back to the cockpit now. Tell Pete to stay alert but not to act unless they make a move, and get the other attendants to secure any loose items in the galleys. As he turned to head back, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. Not severe, but enough to make several passengers reach for their seatbelts. James noticed the 4 suspicious men exchange glances. They were waiting for a distraction, he realized. The turbulence might be exactly what they needed. Walking back toward the cockpit, James made a quick decision. Instead of just returning to his seat, he was going to take control of this situation before it spiraled. The suspicious men had picked the wrong pilot to mess with, and James Walker had a plan that would leave everyone stunned. James reached the cockpit door and entered the security code, feeling the eyes of the bearded man following his every move. Once safely inside, he locked the door and settled back into his seat. What's happening out there? Tom asked, his voice low. 4 men coordinating something. They're getting ready to make a move. James took the controls back from Tom. I need you to send a coded message to Denver Control. Use the weather disturbance protocol, but add the phrase coffee service delayed. That's the signal for potential hijacking. Tom nodded and reached for the radio while James adjusted their heading slightly, buying time. The plane shuddered again as they hit another patch of turbulence. Message sent. Tom confirmed. They've acknowledged. Good, now we wait. The cockpit phone rang, cutting him off. James picked it up. Captain, it's happening. Diane's voice was barely audible. 2 of them are up. One's demanding to speak to you about an emergency. The other is blocking the view from the marshal's seat. Understood. Tell them I'll come out to speak with them. Buy me 2 minutes. James hung up and turned to Tom. When I go out there, lock this door. No matter what you hear, Do not open it unless you hear me say the phrase Montana fishing. That's our safe word. If anyone tries to force their way in, initiate the emergency descent protocol and alert Denver we have a confirmed hijacking." Tom's face had gone pale, but his voice was steady. "Understood, Captain." James took a deep breath. "And if I don't make it back to the cockpit, fly this plane home." Before Tom could respond, James stood up, straightened his uniform, and opened the cockpit door. As he stepped into the forward galley, he closed the door firmly behind him, hearing the lock engage. The bearded man was standing in the aisle, his posture aggressive. Another man, shorter, with wire-rimmed glasses, stood nearby. "Sir, please return to your seat. We're experiencing turbulence," James said calmly, authoritatively. "We need to speak to you immediately," the bearded man demanded. "There's an emergency situation." James noticed the man's right hand was inside his jacket. The second man was slowly positioning himself to block the view from the main cabin. "What kind of emergency?" James asked, stalling for time as he assessed his options. The galley was narrow, giving him little room to maneuver. "The kind that requires you to turn this plane around," the man with glasses said quietly. "We have demands that must be met." "I see," James said evenly. "And those demands are?" The bearded man stepped closer. "Open the cockpit door first. We need to speak privately." "FAA regulations don't allow passengers in the cockpit during flight," James replied, his tone apologetic but firm. "But I'm happy to discuss any concerns you have right here." The men exchanged glances. James could see the bearded man's patience wearing thin. His hand moved slightly in his jacket. "This is not a discussion," the bearded man hissed. "Open the door or people will get hurt." At that moment, the plane hit another pocket of turbulence, more severe this time. The aircraft dropped suddenly, causing both men to stumble. James had been ready for it, planting his feet firmly. In that split second of imbalance, he acted. James grabbed the metal coffee pot from the galley counter and swung it hard, hitting the bearded man's arm just as he was pulling something from his jacket. There was a clatter as a small object, not a gun, James registered with relief, but some kind of taser, fell to the floor. The man with glasses lunged forward, but James was faster. Years of military training kicked in as he delivered a precise strike to the man's solar plexus, sending him gasping against the wall. "Diane." "Now," James shouted. From behind the galley curtain, Diane appeared with the drink cart, ramming it hard into the aisle to block any approach from the other conspirators. At the same moment, Pete the air marshal sprinted up the opposite aisle, weapon drawn. "Federal agent, everyone down," Pete shouted, his badge visible now. The bearded man tried to recover, reaching for James's throat, but the captain sidestepped and used the man's momentum to slam him face first into the galley wall. The man slumped to the floor, dazed. Passengers were screaming now, some ducking in their seats while others craned to see what was happening. The other two conspirators had risen from their seats but froze when they saw Pete's weapon trained on them. "Stay exactly where you are," Pete commanded. "Put your hands on the seat in front of you." James caught his breath, adrenaline still surging. "Diane, get the restraint kit." "Tom," he called through the cockpit door, "Montana fishing. Situation under control." The lock clicked, and Tom peered out, his eyes widening at the scene. "Call Denver," James said. "Tell them we have the situation contained, but we need security ready when we land. And we're going to need 4 pairs of handcuffs." As Pete secured the bearded man, James realized the entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. The timing had been perfect, almost too perfect. These hijackers had clearly underestimated who they were dealing with, but James couldn't help wondering what their real plan had been. Looking at the device on the floor, he had a feeling this was just the beginning of a much larger story. With the immediate threat contained, James wiped sweat from his forehead and surveyed the scene. The bearded man and his accomplice were now secured in flex cuffs, seated in the last row under Pete's watchful eye. The other 2 men had also been restrained, their expressions a mixture of anger and defeat. "I'm returning to the cockpit," James told Diane. "Keep the passengers calm. Tell them there was a medical emergency that's now under control." Back in the pilot's seat, James quickly brought Tom up to speed while adjusting their course. The plane had drifted slightly during the confrontation. "Denver Control wants us to divert to Salt Lake City," Tom said, pointing to the message on their screen. FBI team will meet us there. James nodded. Makes sense. Salt Lake's closer, and we still have those weather systems to worry about. He picked up the radio handset. Denver Control, this is Flight 2473. We are diverting to Salt Lake City as instructed. Situation is contained, but be advised we have 4 suspects in custody. After receiving acknowledgement, James turned to Tom. I need to think like they do. What was their actual plan? Hijacking the plane, obviously, Tom said. Maybe, but something feels off. James reached for the device that had clattered to the floor during the scuffle. Diane had brought it to the cockpit in a napkin to preserve any fingerprints. It wasn't just a taser as he'd first thought. It was more complex, with buttons and a small digital display. This isn't standard equipment for your average hijacker, James murmured. Let's think this through step by step. He activated the plane's public address system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Walker speaking. We're making an unscheduled landing in Salt Lake City due to a security situation that has now been resolved. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll be on the ground in approximately 40 minutes. After switching off the PA, James turned to Tom. Check their luggage manifests. What did they bring on board? Tom pulled up the passenger information on their screen. 4 carry-ons, all went through security. Nothing unusual flagged. And yet they somehow smuggled this device on board, James said, indicating the object wrapped in the napkin. Which means either they have someone working at O'Hare Security or what? Tom asked when James fell silent. Or this thing is made of components that individually don't trigger security alarms. James frowned, his mind racing. What if they weren't trying to take over the plane? What if they were planning to use the plane itself for something else? The thought sent a chill through both men. James picked up the phone to the cabin. Deanne, I need you to check something. Ask Pate to search their carry-ons. Carefully. Look for anything unusual, especially electronic components. While waiting for a response, James contacted air traffic control again, requesting information about any unusual air traffic in their vicinity. The radio crackled with the controller's voice. Flight 2473, we are tracking what appears to be an unauthorized aircraft approximately 15 miles southeast of your position. It appeared on radar about 10 minutes ago and is maintaining altitude just below commercial traffic. James and Tom exchanged glances. That's it, James said. They weren't trying to hijack us. They were trying to use our transponder data somehow. The phone rang, and James grabbed it. What did you find? Pete found small electronic devices in all 4 bags, Diane reported. They look like some kind of signal boosters or receivers. And Captain, there's a laptop with what looks like flight trajectory software. Everything suddenly clicked into place for James. These weren't traditional hijackers. They were trying to execute something much more sophisticated. Tom shut down our secondary transponder and switch our communications to backup frequencies, James ordered, his hands already moving across the control panel. What's happening? Tom asked, even as he followed the instructions. They were trying to clone our identity, James explained, his voice tight with concentration. That unidentified aircraft is probably trying to use our flight data to mask itself on radar. If it carries our transponder signature, it could fly anywhere in our vicinity without raising alarms. James made a quick decision. It was time to show these criminals they'd picked the wrong pilot to mess with. He would need to execute a series of tactical maneuvers that would both shake any electronic lock they might have on his plane's systems and alert air traffic control to the actual threat. Denver Control, this is Flight 2473, James said it into the radio. We have reason to believe we are being electronically shadowed by that unidentified aircraft. Request permission for emergency protocols. There was a moment of silence before the controller responded. Flight 2473, permission granted. What do you need? James took a deep breath. The chess game in the skies was about to get interesting, and he intended to win. I'm going to execute a series of identification maneuvers. Alert all nearby traffic, and have Salt Lake City prepare for a priority landing. We're bringing this situation home. James's hands moved with practiced precision across the controls. 25 years of flying had prepared him for many emergencies, but this situation was unlike anything in the training manuals. Tom, alert the passengers we're going to experience some unusual movements. Tell them it's related to the weather systems we're navigating around." Tom nodded and made the announcement while James studied the radar. The unidentified aircraft was maintaining its position relative to their flight path, a clear sign it was using their signal as cover. "I'm going to execute what we called a ghost break in the Air Force," James explained. "It's a series of deliberate heading and altitude changes designed to break any electronic tracking lock." "Is that safe with passengers?" Tom asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'll keep it within commercial limits," James assured him. "But everyone's going to feel it." James picked up the radio again. "Denver Control, Flight 2473 beginning identification maneuvers. We're going to drop 2,000 feet and execute a 30-degree heading change to starboard." "Understood, Flight 2473. We're clearing that airspace for you." James looked at Tom. "Ready?" Tom tightened his harness. "Ready, Captain." James took a deep breath and pushed the controls forward. The Boeing 737 responded immediately, its nose dipping as they began a controlled descent. Through the cabin phone, he could hear muffled exclamations from passengers. "Now for the turn," James announced, banking the massive aircraft to the right. The combined maneuver created a sensation like a roller coaster, not dangerous, but definitely unexpected in commercial flight. James kept his eyes fixed on the radar, watching for the shadow aircraft's response. "They're trying to follow," Tom observed, pointing at the radar screen. "But there's a lag." "Exactly what I was counting on," James said. "Their systems can't adjust fast enough if they're trying to clone our signal." As the plane leveled out at the new altitude, James didn't waste a second. "Now we go up 1,000 feet and bank left. This should completely break their lock." He pulled back on the controls, sending the plane climbing while simultaneously banking to the left. The engines roared with the extra power needed for the climb. Through the phone, Diane reported, "Passengers are secured but alarmed. The 4 suspects are looking extremely nervous." "Good," James replied tersely. "Keep them that way." On the radar, the mystery aircraft was struggling to mirror their movements. Its path had become erratic as it tried to follow their unexpected maneuvers. "Denver Control, the unidentified aircraft is showing confusion. Do you have military intercept available?" James asked. "Affirmative, Flight 2473. Air National Guard fighters are scrambling from Hill Air Force Base. ETA 6 minutes to your position." James nodded in satisfaction. Now for the final move. Without warning, he pushed the throttle forward and executed what pilots call a sudden climb maneuver, a rapid ascent that would feel like an elevator shooting upward. The plane's powerful engines responded with a deep rumble that vibrated through the entire aircraft. In the passenger cabin, people gasped as they felt pressed into their seats. The 4 restrained men exchanged panicked looks. Whatever plan they had was falling apart. "Look!" Tom exclaimed, pointing at the radar. "They've broken off. The shadow aircraft is veering south." James allowed himself a small smile. "They know they've been made. They're running." The radio crackled with an urgent message from Denver Control. "Flight 2473, we confirm the unidentified aircraft has disengaged and is now heading south at high speed. Air National Guard has a visual and is in pursuit." "Mission accomplished," James said, leveling the plane at their new cruising altitude. "Let's get these people safely to Salt Lake City." He picked up the cabin phone again. "Diane, tell the passengers we've completed our weather avoidance maneuvers and are proceeding normally to our landing." "How are our friends doing?" "The bearded one is looking sick," Diane reported with a hint of satisfaction. "The others aren't much better. Whatever they planned, they definitely didn't expect you." James switched the public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Walker. I apologize for the unexpected maneuvers. We had to navigate around some severe weather systems. We'll be landing in Salt Lake City in approximately 20 minutes. The flight attendants will be coming through the cabin to check that everything is secure for landing." As he signed off, Tom gave him a look of respect mixed with awe. "I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a plane like that in commercial service." James shrugged modestly. Sometimes the old skills come in handy. Below them, the landscape of Utah was coming into view, snow-capped mountains and the vast salt flats shining in the afternoon sun. James began their descent sequence, his movements now gentle and precise. "We still don't know exactly what they were planning," Tom said quietly. "No," James agreed, his expression somber. "But whatever it was, it ended today." As they approached Salt Lake City International Airport, James could see police vehicles and what appeared to be FBI SUVs waiting on the tarmac. This wasn't over yet, but the worst of the danger had passed. "Prepare for landing," he instructed Tom. "Let's bring everyone home safe." The landing at Salt Lake City was textbook perfect, despite the circumstances. James guided the Boeing 737 down with gentle precision, the wheels touching the runway with barely a bump. As they taxied toward their designated area, he could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles and law enforcement waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," James announced over the PA system, "we've arrived safely in Salt Lake City. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. We'll be parking at a remote area of the airport, and there will be security personnel boarding before we deplane. Please follow all instructions from the authorities." The plane came to a stop in an isolated section of the tarmac, surrounded by police cars, FBI vehicles, and two ominous black SUVs. Armed officers in tactical gear approached the aircraft as soon as the engines powered down. "Deanne," James said through the cabin phone, "open the doors and let the authorities board. Have Pete identify himself immediately so there's no confusion." James and Tom completed the shutdown procedures as the first FBI agents entered the cockpit. "Captain Walker?" A woman in a dark suit showed her credentials. "Special Agent Lisa Chen, FBI. We need a quick briefing before we process the suspects." James nodded and gave her a concise rundown of everything that had happened, from his initial suspicions to the confrontation and the subsequent aerial maneuvers. "The device they were carrying is there," he said, pointing to the napkin-wrapped object. "And their bags contain what appear to be signal boosters or cloning equipment." Agent Chen listened intently, occasionally nodding. "This matches our intelligence," she said when James finished. "We believe these men are part of a sophisticated operation that's been attempting to compromise commercial flights for several months." "What exactly were they trying to do?" Tom asked. "Based on what you've described, they were attempting to clone your aircraft's identity to create a ghost plane, one that could fly below or alongside commercial traffic without raising alarms. It's a new technique we've been tracking." James frowned. "To what end?" "That's what we intend to find out," Chen replied grimly. "The Shadow aircraft was intercepted by Air National Guard fighters about 50 miles south of here. They'd forced it to land at a small airfield. We have teams securing it now." Outside the cockpit window, James could see the 4 suspects being escorted off the plane in handcuffs, surrounded by armed agents. "Your passengers will be processed through a separate terminal," Chen continued. "We'll need detailed statements from both of you, the flight attendants and the air marshal. But first, we need to check the aircraft for any devices they might have planted." James nodded. "Of course, whatever you need." For the next hour, bomb-sniffing dogs and technicians with electronic scanning equipment went through every inch of the plane. Meanwhile, James and Tom gave their statements to FBI agents in a mobile command center set up on the tarmac. "You know," one agent said to James as they finished, "most pilots would have radioed for instructions and waited for authorities to handle it after landing. Taking action mid-flight like that, it was risky." James shrugged. "When you've flown through missile fire in the Gulf, your definition of risky changes. I assessed the situation and made a judgment call." "Well, it was the right call," Agent Chen said, returning with a tablet in hand. "Preliminary reports from the Shadow aircraft seizure are coming in. They'd found sophisticated electronic warfare equipment and what appears to be an experimental payload delivery system." "Payload?" Tom asked, his face paling. "You mean like a weapon?" Chen nodded grimly. "We're still analyzing it, but yes, that's our current assessment. They were using your flight as cover to approach a potential target." James felt his stomach tighten. The full implications of what might have happened were beginning to sink in. "The passengers," he said. "When can they continue their journey?" "We're arranging alternative transportation to Seattle," Chen replied. "But first, there's someone who wants to speak with you." She turned her tablet around to show a video call in progress. On the screen was a serious-looking man in a suit that screamed government official. "Captain Walker, this is Deputy Director Williams from Homeland Security. He'd like a word." James straightened his uniform tie and nodded, prepared to explain his actions, but the deputy director spoke first. "Captain Walker, I've just been briefed on your actions today. On behalf of the Department of Homeland Security and the American people, I want to thank you for your exceptional service and quick thinking." "I was just doing my job, sir," James replied modestly. "No, Captain. You went well beyond your job description today. Our analysts believe you prevented what could have been a catastrophic incident. The full details are classified, but suffice to say, a lot of people owe you their lives." James absorbed this information silently, his expression serious. Throughout his career, he'd always maintained that proper training and alertness were more important than heroics. Today had proven that point. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," the deputy director said, "we need your expertise for the investigation, and when that's done, well, there might be a job offer coming your way if you're interested in putting those skills to use beyond the cockpit." James glanced at Tom, then back at the screen. "With all due respect, sir, I still have passengers to get to Seattle. One emergency at a time." For the first time, the deputy director smiled. "Understood, Captain. We'll talk again soon." As the call ended, Agent Chen looked at James with newfound respect. "Your passengers are being well taken care of. A replacement aircraft is being prepped now. It should be ready in about 3 hours." James nodded. "Then I'd like to speak with my crew and passengers. They deserve an explanation, even if we can't tell them everything." As he walked across the tarmac toward the terminal building, James thought about what had almost happened today. In the sky, split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. He'd made the right calls today, just as he'd been trained to do. But something told him this wasn't over yet. The deputy director's words suggested a larger threat still looming. Whatever it was, James Walker would be ready. 2 days after the dramatic events over Utah, James Walker stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the early morning sun cast long shadows across his backyard. The news had been carefully managed, a security incident on a diverted flight, with few details released to the public. But aviation forums were buzzing with rumors about the pilot who had outmaneuvered terrorists mid-flight. His phone rang, breaking the morning quiet. "Captain Walker? This is Superintendent Hayes from the Flight Standards District Office. We've completed our review of the incident." James took a sip of coffee, preparing himself. Performing unusual maneuvers with a commercial airliner full of passengers, regardless of the circumstances, could still result in disciplinary action. "And," he asked calmly, "and we've determined that your actions were not only justified but exemplary. The FAA will be issuing a commendation for your handling of the situation." Relief washed over James. "Thank you, sir. That's good to hear." "There's more," Hayes continued. "The airline CEO wants to meet with you today. Can you be at headquarters by noon?" 3 hours later, James walked into the gleaming corporate headquarters of Transcontinental Airlines. He'd traded his pilot's uniform for a simple dark suit. The receptionist recognized him immediately. "Captain Walker, they're waiting for you in the boardroom." James was surprised to find not only the CEO, but also his entire flight crew from Flight 2473, Tom, Deanne, and the other attendants. Even Pate the air marshal was there, now dressed in a regular suit instead of his passenger disguise. The CEO, a tall woman with silver hair, stepped forward. "Captain Walker, on behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, I want to express our profound gratitude for your actions 2 days ago." She gestured around the room. "Everyone here has been thoroughly debriefed by federal authorities. While much remains classified, we now understand the full scope of what you prevented." James nodded, feeling slightly uncomfortable with all the attention. "We were just doing our jobs." "No," Tom interjected. "You were doing something extraordinary. The rest of us followed your lead." Diane stepped forward. "The FBI told me those men had been planning this for months. They picked our flight specifically because it matched the profile they needed: right time, right route, right aircraft type. But they couldn't have known about you." The CEO motioned everyone to sit at the large conference table. "The authorities have given us permission to share certain details with you, as the crew directly involved." She pressed a button. and the windows darkened as a screen descended from the ceiling. A video began playing, aerial footage of the Shadow aircraft that had been following their flight. It was a modified private jet with unusual antennae protruding from its fuselage. This aircraft was equipped with advanced electronic warfare systems, the CEO explained. According to Homeland Security, they were attempting to use your flight as cover to approach a high-value target in the Seattle area. Your quick thinking exposed their presence and forced them to abort. James watched the footage silently, feeling a chill as the full implications became clear. There's something else, the CEO continued, sliding a folder across the table. The airline would like to create a new position, Director of Flight Security Training. We need someone who understands both the technical aspects of flying and the security challenges we face. Someone who can train other pilots to recognize and respond to threats. James opened the folder to find a job offer with a salary substantially higher than his captain's pay. You wouldn't have to give up flying entirely, she added, but you'd be helping us build a safer airline. James looked around at his crew, the people who had trusted his judgment when everything was on the line. Their faces showed a mixture of pride and encouragement. I'll consider it, he said finally. But first, I'd like to finish what we started. We still have passengers waiting to complete their journey to Seattle. The CEO smiled. I thought you might say that. There's a plane waiting at the terminal. Same crew, if you're all willing. Consider it a redemption flight. 2 hours later, James was back in uniform, completing his pre-flight checks in the cockpit of a Boeing 737. Tom sat beside him, reviewing the flight plan. You know, Tom said quietly, when I was in flight school, my instructor said there are pilots who can fly planes, and then there are true aviators who become one with their aircraft. I never really understood what he meant until I watched you the other day. James smiled slightly. My first instructor told me something similar. He said flying isn't about the machinery, it's about judgment. The plane doesn't care about your credentials or experience. It only responds to what you actually do in the moment of decision. The cabin door closed, and Diane's voice came through the intercom. Cabin secure, Captain. And you should know, many of the original passengers from Flight 2473 specifically requested to be on this flight when they heard you were piloting. James felt a swell of emotion at this news. He clicked on the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain James Walker. On behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, I want to welcome you aboard Flight 2790 to Seattle. Some of you were with us 2 days ago when our journey was interrupted. I promise you a smoother ride today. There was a smattering of applause from the cabin. As they taxied toward the runway, James thought about the job offer waiting on his kitchen table at home. Perhaps it was time to share what he knew with a new generation of pilots. After all, the skies were changing, new threats requiring new skills. But for now, there was a flight to complete, passengers to deliver safely to their destination. He advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the powerful engines respond. Transcontinental 2790, you are cleared for takeoff, the controller's voice announced. James nodded to Tom. Let's take her home. The Boeing accelerated down the runway and lifted gracefully into the clear blue sky, banking gently toward the northwest. Behind them, Salt Lake City receded into the distance as they climbed toward cruising altitude. The journey continued just as it always had. But something had changed, not just for James Walker, but for everyone who flew the crowded skies of America. A new awareness, a higher vigilance. And somewhere in the system, 4 men were facing justice because they had made one crucial mistake. They had picked the wrong pilot to mess with.